California and Texas are the two largest states in the contiguous U.S. and the two states with the highest population overall. They could be considered the powerhouses of modern America, heavily contributing to the country's economy and influencing its politics. In fact, if they were independent, they would rank among the top 10 countries in the world by GDP. However, for all these apparent similarities, the Golden State and the Lone Star State couldn't be more different. How, you ask? Well, keep watching while we cover every major aspect of living in these states, from economy and politics to general quality of life. Since we mentioned that the states would rank in the top 10 in terms of global economics, let's start from there. California is the country's largest economy by a long shot, with a GDP of roughly $3.85 trillion, which translates to roughly $99,000 per capita. Texas isn't lagging economically either, with a total GDP of $2.56 trillion and a GDP per capita of $84,000. Let's take a look at each state's economies over the past few years. Particularly, let's look at how the economies have changed since 2019. In 2020, both states reported a slight fall in the overall GDP, negative 1.7% for Texas and negative 1.3% for California. This was to be expected. After all, 2020 was the year of the global economic crisis ushered in by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. But where the states start differing is how they bounced back. In 2021, the GDPs of Texas and California grew by 5.7% and 7.6% respectively. But then California's growth slowed down. While Texas recorded growths of 2.7% and 5.7% over 2022 and 2023, California's economy only grew by 0.7% and 2.7%. So California is the overall winner in terms of sheer economy size, but how does that trickle down to the people who live in the state? It turns out that the answer is, it depends. For one, the taxes between the two states are practically worlds apart. Texas is one of the more famous examples of a state government that doesn't collect any income tax. By contrast, the highest income tax bracket rate for California is just over 14%. The state uses a progressive tax bracket model, so the actual result can vary. For a more realistic scenario, taking into account the median wage of both states, around $85,000 for California and around $74,000 for Texas as of May of 2022, the median Californian pays roughly $7,000 a year more on income tax. The other major contributor to taxation is property taxes. This is where it gets a bit tricky. On paper, California has a lower tax rate than Texas. If a property cost roughly $280,000, around the median house value in the US, California property taxes would be roughly 2.5 times lower than that of Texas. But there's a big catch here: median property value. While you could feasibly find a property that goes for between $200K and $300K in Texas, the average property in California costs 2.5 times as much. In fact, San Francisco is probably among the worst cities when it comes to property costs, with the cost of the average house at a staggering $1.25 million. Compare that to the average home value in Dallas at less than $400,000. The housing situation only becomes worse when you consider that we've already gone over the difference in median wages. Therefore, it's no surprise that Texas was one of the states that saw the biggest immigration numbers over the past few years. Texas, for all its economic prosperity, has consistently ranked as a state with below average cost of living in the country. The biggest cities where the cost of living would be assumed to be much larger were only roughly 10% more expensive than the national average. On the other hand, the cost of living in California is 50% higher than the national average, with San Francisco earning its second trophy for the most expensive city due to a cost of living 86% over the average. That's nearly double. For all its faults when it comes to living costs, California does come through on occasion. The state and local governments spend significantly more money on residents, just over $16,000 per resident, versus around $10,000 per resident for Texas. The biggest difference in government spending was on social services, where California spent roughly twice as much. This is evident through nearly a third of the state's residents being on Medicaid, compared to only 16% in Texas. Texas spends the highest percentage of its state and local government budget on education. And even there, the raw numbers favor California by roughly $600 per resident. Next, let's jump into how the two states prepare children and young adults for future careers and compare their education systems. Due to the sheer size of the states, it's practically impossible to go really in-depth here. But we'll look at a few particularly useful metrics, such as state spending, average scores, and general education quality. As we previously mentioned, both local and state governments of California and Texas spend significant amounts on education, particularly K-12 education. One of the major factors that influence this spending is the fact that both states have a disproportionately high percentage of students classified as English language learners, at roughly 19% for both states compared to the national average of 10%. That means that roughly 1 in 5 children were deemed to require additional assistance to meet national standards in the English language. The biggest factor for this classification is cultural background, i.e. students whose native language isn't English, which points to the fact that both states have much higher cultural and language variances. But let's go back to educational spending and results. California has spent close to the national average for every student, around $13,000, while spending in Texas is much lower at only $10,000. On the other hand, some states with similar costs of living as California, such as New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, have spent nearly double the amounts on their students. As a result, California's K-12 education system is lagging behind the national average. This is particularly contrasted by the fact that during 2020, K-12 teachers in California earned, on average, much more than their peers in other states. The salary in California was around $72,000, while the national average was close to $50,000. By comparison, Texan teachers earned $51,000. Big jump there. However, another number can potentially reveal why California is having trouble with education: the number of students per teacher. In California, this figure is at around 23, while Texas has a much more manageable 15. This could explain why the graduation rate for high schools in California is only 85%, compared to Texas's 90%. The public school system in California is practically overwhelmed by students whose needs can't be met due to sheer class sizes. Therefore, it's not particularly surprising that California ranks 34th in public school ranking, compared to Texas slotting in at 29. However, California ends up with a notable edge in higher education, particularly universities. In a 2024 list of the top 500 universities in the US, California has 17 universities in the top 100, with Stanford being in second place. On the other hand, Texas only has 5 universities in the top 100. Worse yet, the state's top ranker, Rice University in Austin, only managed to reach 9th place this year. This shows that students in California typically have much better opportunities for higher learning, and the universities end up being more prestigious. So while Texas has a small lead in elementary and high school education, California is the place to obtain a graduate degree. But now let's take a deeper dive into how the people in these states actually live. Both California and Texas have a rich history rooted in the state's origins and natural resources. For California, that translates to having the most national parks of all the states in the US. At 9 parks, it's even more than Alaska. As a result, most Californians are well within a day's drive from scenic nature with extensive hiking trails. Additionally, since the state is much smaller than Texas yet has pretty much every biome available, you're never truly far away from the beach, mountains, deserts, or the wine-bearing valleys. With an overall Mediterranean climate, most of California experiences warm summers and cold winters, with the exception of Southern California, which shifts into the hot desert climate. Somewhat unfortunately, this causes California to experience some of the harshest summers throughout the US, leading to 33 droughts and wildfire disasters since 1980. The state also experiences the other end of the spectrum for disasters, with flooding and freezing events, albeit much less frequently. But it's the diverse culture of California that elevates its natural wonders to a new level. For example, Los Angeles is widely considered to be one of the best food destinations in all of the US. The LA food scene excels at giving its residents a seamless blend of global food trends and accessibility. While you can find foods from any corner of the globe in upscale restaurants, the street food scene perfectly encapsulates the melting pot of cultures that California has become, which we'll cover a bit later in the video. On the other side of the comparison, Texas is perhaps best known for its stereotype of being a state of barbecue-munching, pickup-driving cowboys. But the state is so much beyond that. One of the best parts about the culture in Texas is how diverse it is due to the state's sheer size and scale. The state's large area translates to a diversity in both nature and climate. The east side of the state faces the hurricane-prone Gulf of Mexico, which translates into a humid subtropical climate that experiences sweltering heat in the summer and relatively hot winters. The southwest of the state dips into the hot desert climate, while the northwest experiences a much more nuanced arid climate. That does leave Texas as one of the states hit the hardest by both hurricanes and tornadoes, but the weather in Texas ends up being as varied as its people, and that all culminates in a culture that incorporates the state's rich history and future-oriented modernity. As such, you can find a veritable plethora of things to do when it comes to food, exploration, music, and hobbies. But enough about leisure. How do the state residents earn their wages? Surprisingly, both California and Texas are quite similar in that regard. The states have a heavy focus on tech and industry. In California, there's the world-famous Silicon Valley, which forms the bulk of the state's demand for tech job postings. The state's large and aging population also cements a need for healthcare and social service work. California's largest cities are veritable economic hubs on the country's west coast, pulling in the retail sector. Salary-wise, California is regularly listed as one of the top 5 states with the highest average and median salaries. However, that is slightly offset by the comparatively high cost of living. On the other hand, Texas is the country's powerhouse in the energy sector, particularly oil and gas extraction and refinement. Additionally, the cheap real estate, relatively low utility costs, and slightly lower wage demands have led to the tech sector booming in the state concurrently with the COVID pandemic. Industry giants such as Tesla, Oracle, and HP have all transferred their main offices to Texas, and from California no less, in recent years. The state is also experiencing a severe demand for new construction due to population changes, and the healthcare sector is expected to follow. Both states experienced a similar level of unemployment, around 5% for California and 4% for Texas, with both on a worryingly upward short-term trend. Transportation and roadway infrastructure can heavily influence both local and statewide economies. In terms of sheer spending and road state, neither state seems the clear winner, at least on paper. California spends nearly 50% more on transportation infrastructure, $44 billion versus $30 billion per year, and its per capita spending is higher. On the other hand, Texas is a much bigger spender, roughly 70% more per capita spending when it comes to highway infrastructure. This doesn't seem all that surprising considering the relative scale of land areas that the governments have to cover in roadways to enable traffic mobility. This is exacerbated by the state's relative population densities, differences between rural and urban areas, as well as the organization of highways. All things said, the average Californian spends 84 hours sitting in traffic per year, while a Texan spends only 63 hours on the road. When accounting for the average wages of respective countries, California residents lose about $1,200 per year in lost time in traffic, while Texans only lose $900. One important caveat to transport is that it's not all about interstate traffic. Texas is a centrally positioned state, roughly halfway between the east and west coast. Dallas-Fort Worth hosts the second busiest airport in the country, and the fact that the ports in Texas open to the Atlantic Ocean means Texas is an incredibly important hub for transporting both people and cargo throughout the US and beyond. California does have the benefit of access to the West Coast and the Asia-Pacific market, as well as the fourth busiest airport, which makes it similarly important for U.S. transport. Additionally, California has more policies on reducing the carbon footprint of vehicles. Since 2007, California's per capita use of gas dropped by 10%, while the same metric in Texas rose by 11%. But the apparent similarities in the state's industries and infrastructure aside, perhaps the biggest difference between the two states lies in their population, demographics, and politics. We've already mentioned that California is the country's most populous state. In 2024, the population was estimated to be just under 39 million. However, 4 years ago, the population was nearly 39.5 million. The state has reached a 10-year low in population, despite the country as a whole having a persistently positive population change. On the other hand, Texas has experienced what could be considered a population boom. From 27 million residents in 2015, the state has unofficially passed the 30 million mark in 2024. Throughout the past 4 years, the state has achieved some of the highest population growth percentages in the country. So what's making California so undesirable and Texas so wanted? In a sentence, Texas has a lower cost of living, much better real estate, and similar job opportunities. In fact, Californians themselves are partially to blame for the shift. In 2021, the number of people who moved from California to Texas was just under 110,000, the single largest state-to-state migratory flow of the year. But how has that affected the states? It's time to talk about politics. California has been a Democrat trifecta state since 2011, meaning that the Democrat Party controls all three major branches of government. On the other hand, Texas has been a Republican trifecta state all the way back to 2003. Naturally, this means that the states have pretty much opposite outlooks on politics, which isn't far from the truth. California is considered one of the most liberal states in the country. It's been one of the forerunners of progressive policies such as climate change, LGBTQ+ rights, and healthcare. California also leads the way in terms of urban population. Roughly 90% of Californians are considered to be living in urban environments, which means that local policies heavily favor urban sprawl. On the other hand, Texas is only roughly 75% urban. This leaves close to 7 million people living in what are considered rural communities. If they were in a state by themselves, it would be the 15th most populous state in the country. As a result, Texas is experiencing localized geopolitical issues, where the government has to more carefully balance the needs and policies pertaining to the state's urban and rural population. These affect infrastructure, healthcare, real estate, housing, and transportation. Additionally, of the 254 counties in Texas, roughly 90 are towing the line between Democrat and Republican. This makes Texas much less unified in terms of local politics. This can be considered a boon by some, as the state's variety and size make it more appealing to immigrants, whether from the US or abroad. However, the rapid population changes and the state's leanings toward more liberal voters make for a lot of political ambiguity, which could indicate a potential shift in state politics. So where does that leave us in the California versus Texas debate? No state is perfect, obviously, and the same goes for these two. Both Texas and California heavily depend on local and global geopolitics and trade between states. While California offers some of the highest living standards and wages in the country, it does so with an overwhelming real estate cost that makes generational wealth and investments practically a necessity. On the other hand, Texas is more attractive to newcomers, with a lower cost of living yet booming tech, energy, and public sectors. However, the state could experience a reversal in politics and public policy precisely due to the sudden population and, more importantly, demographic shifts. But what do you think? Would you prefer to live in California or Texas? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching and take care out there.